Dustin, Alison. Brilliant. So look, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to meet you all on the screen. And Alison invited me to come and talk a little bit about the issue of gambling advertising in Great Britain. And I'll touch a little bit on the impact of gambling advertising, how it's regulated, what I'd like to see happen about it, and sort of where we are politically. And then there'll be time for questions at the end. I think we'll stop recording for the questions so people can feel free to speak as freely as they wish without concern that their questions or challenges will end up on the internet. So we can hold questions till the end, but I'll make sure that there's enough time for that. So as Alison generously introduced me, my name is Will Prochaska. I've been working in gambling reform for a little over 5 years. I started by supporting Liz and Charles Ritchie to establish Gambling with Lives, a charity that helps families bereaved by gambling-related suicide, which is a big issue in Britain and in other jurisdictions where gambling has been liberalised in similar ways that it has done here. And I left Gambling with Lives about a year ago. I still work with them very closely. You can see their logo here. I work with them very closely, but for the past year, I've been running something called the Coalition to End Gambling Ads, which is a group of public health institutions, mental health organisations, sports clubs, and campaigners, all of who want to see an end to gambling being promoted. So it's not our ambition to ban gambling or to prohibit gambling, as we are often accused of wanting to do, but it is our ambition that gambling should not be promoted in society. There's absolutely no need for it to be promoted because it's a health-harming activity and a health-harming industry. So that's the underpinning of the Coalition to End Gambling Ads. Our activities focus mainly on public-facing campaigns and films, as well as influencing politicians. So I spend a lot of my time working with members of parliament, peers in the House of Lords, as well as officials at various ministries, trying to convince them all to support the cause and to do something about the scourge, which is gambling advertising in this country. We are a pretty small outfit. It's basically just me who's involved. I have a little support from a couple of other people here and there, but it's a very small kind of grassroots campaign really that is pushing ahead on this topic. Although our members, you would have seen on the earlier slide, include some really well-established institutions in Britain. So we now have, as of next week, it will be announced that the Faculty of Public Health will be joining as members, and they're joining the Association of Directors of Public Health and the Royal Society of Public Health. So those are the three together. They make up the three leading public health institutions, non-governmental public health institutions in Britain, with very esteemed histories. So we do have some real clout in our membership. The Money and Mental Health Policy Institute that was founded by Martin Lewis is going to join. As is, we're about to announce our first local authority member next week as well. So it's quite an exciting time at the coalition. We've got some real heavyweight members joining who aren't gambling specialists. And I think that's really important and significant because this isn't an issue that only those who've been harmed directly by gambling or specialist gambling harm charities should be concerned about. I think this is an issue which actually touches many, many millions of people in Britain, and that we should all be concerned about because it's a risk to all of us and to our communities and our families. So I'm very pleased to see that it's starting to get, certainly through the coalition, it's starting to get broader concern. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the issue of gambling advertising, and I thought I would start with these two statistics that don't immediately seem like they're linked, but they are, and I would urge people to consider these two statistics together. First is that online operators, so online gambling companies, make 86% of their profits from 5% of customers. And if you believe the House of Lords, that top 5% of customers are either addicted or at risk of addiction and experiencing harm. So we have a business model which is very heavily based on harming people. So this industry cannot grow and it cannot sustain itself without causing a mental health harm. And the other statistic there is that 1.5 billion per year is spent on advertising, which is an enormous sum of money for an industry which isn't actually all that big in terms of turnover. So the industry takes about 15 billion pounds a year of losses from the British public. It's not a small number, but it doesn't put it in the top tier of industries in Britain by any stretch. So why is it spending 10% of its turnover, of its gross profit, akin to gross profit, the losses that people experience? Why is it spending that much of that money on advertising? And it's linked to that statistic above. And the issue here is that the gambling industry is dependent on a very small percentage of its customers to sustain itself and to grow. But the problem is that those customers cannot sustain those level of losses. The industry churns through them really quite rapidly. It will allow them to go and take debt and then gamble that. It will often, there's lots of evidence that the industry overlooks certain crimes that are committed to fund further gambling activities. But realistically, once those customers have run out of funds and have run out of new sources that they can go and find additional funds, the industry needs to replace them. And so that's why it spends so much on advertising, and that's why we are all inundated by it. I say we are all, if you watch sport or you turn on your television or you turn on the internet, you will see gambling advertising pretty rapidly. But particularly if you are a young man, women are considered to be a growth market for the industry, often lured in through inducements around bingo, which sort of pertain to be bingo, but they've really got very little to do with bingo apart from the name. And actually, pensioners are now a target market for the industry as well because they have available funds and time, and so there's a growth market there for the industry in terms of pensioners too. Yep. Now the evidence is clear that the advertising works, and for some of what I say, I suspect you'll sort of be looking at me down the screen thinking, why on earth is he telling us what is clearly obvious, right? Why would an industry spend 1.5 billion pounds on something if it didn't give them a return on that investment? It's a commercial industry. They're not going to spend that for fun, are they? But the world that I work in, with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, who oversee gambling, I'm afraid this isn't obvious. Okay, so the claims of the industry are that actually we only advertise, often people in the industry will say, we only advertise because we're looking for market share. So it's just to compete against our competitors. It isn't to go and attract new customers. People will gamble anyway, right? They'll say. That's not true. And the Gambling Commission statistics show that that's not true. And you can see here a third of people who gambled in the past 12 months. This is a piece of research which they commissioned a couple of years ago. A third of people who gambled in the past 12 months were induced to do so through gambling, or encouraged to do so through gambling advertising, excuse me. And the evidence clearly shows that actually gambling advertising is extremely effective at getting people to gamble for the first time. So people who haven't gambled before, and also getting people to gamble more once they've started gambling. And that's critical for the industry. They don't want people to just put one bet on the football on the weekend or to gamble on the Grand National once a year. That's not what they're interested in. That will not sustain the 15 billion pounds of losses that they want to take and grow from the British public, right? They want people gambling as continuously as possible. So once they've got your details, a lot of the advertising will be direct inducements to gamble. So they encourage people to gamble more and more and more through offering them free bets. We know actually there was a case which a judge ruled on against Sky Betting and Gaming this week, where Sky Betting and Gaming were found to have used a certain gambler's data against him. They were able to aggregate all of the times that he'd gambled, all of the products that he'd gambled on, so that they knew that they could send him free bets in the morning. He was more susceptible in the morning to receiving free bets. So they targeted him when he woke up, sending free bets to his mobile phone and his computer to try and get him to start gambling in the morning. And these are the practices that the industry use. They're able to really use data against their customers to try and get them to gamble more than they otherwise would, and to get them to become addicted. there's also a lot of evidence that gambling advertising causes harm. And again, you might think that that's obvious, but if you were employed by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, you would question such an assertion. Or if you were employed by the industry's lobby, the Betting and Gaming Council, you would question such an assertion. So the industry say consistently that there is no evidence that links gambling advertising to harm. Right now, this sort of defies logic, right? Because most people in the street, most members of the public would think, well, gambling harm is caused by gambling, hence the name, and therefore anything that encourages people to gamble will eventually lead to harm at some point, right? For at least some of those people. So it's self-evident that if you grow gambling, you're going to also grow gambling harm. But the industry and DCMS question that assertion, and they kind of question it. They base their entire dogma and approach to gambling legislation and regulation on a narrative that's been created by, well, it was first created by the tobacco industry, to my knowledge, and has been used very effectively by a range of harmful industries thereafter, and used extremely effectively by the gambling industry. And the narrative goes something like this, which is gambling is safe. There are some people who will become addicted to it through probably fault of their own. They might have a pre-existing condition, they might already be depressed, or they might have family trouble, or they might have something wrong in their brain chemistry that makes them vulnerable to becoming a gambling addict. But the rest of us are absolutely fine, and we can gamble safely without problem. Okay? So what you want to do, government, is not ruin the fun of most of us who can gamble responsibly, but what you want to do is just put some protections around that vulnerable few who are likely to become gambling addicts. And this allows you, from that foundation, it allows you to come up with policies which can say, and I'll come back to this later, which can say, oh, well, we're going to grow the gambling industry and reduce harm at the same time. You can only come up with that policy position if you take as a starting point that not everybody is at risk of gambling harm, only a small number are. The evidence refutes that entirely. But of course, if you don't want to listen to the evidence for whatever reason, then you end up with a set of regulations as we have them today. We've actually got more evidence in Britain than most other European countries combined. An academic analysis found, analyzing the number of academic papers linking gambling advertising to harm in Britain was more than the combined total of 3 or 4 leading European nations on this point. But in Britain, we've got the most liberalized regulatory environment of any European nation that I'm aware of, and quite possibly globally. So you can see from this slide the approach of a handful of other countries to gambling advertising, different types of advertising running across the top, from sports sponsorship, targeted ads, posters, TV and radio, all that sort of thing. And you can see most countries have banned or restricted at least some of those forms of gambling advertising, except Great Britain, which has allowed them all. And this is indicative of the fact that Britain has, I believe, the most liberalized gambling market in the world. And advertising was key, enabling advertising was key to supporting that market to grow. This is all a result of a piece of legislation called the Gambling Act, which was pushed through in 2005, came into effect in 2007, and was designed by the then Labour administration as a way to grow the gambling industry on the premise that it would be great for tax revenue, and again on this foundation that most people can gamble responsibly, and the results of which have been pretty disastrous. Maybe I'll just talk here. I don't have a slide on it, but I'll talk here about some of the impacts of all of this and kind of the state of gambling and gambling harm in Great Britain. So I've told you that the public loses £15 billion a year to gambling each year. The latest statistics on the scale of the harm are really very, very frightening indeed. So the Gambling Commission's latest survey, published last year found that 2.5% of adults would be classified as problem gamblers. And a further 12% of adults in this country are gambling at elevated levels of risk and experiencing harm. So you've got something like 14.5% of the adult population showing signs of harm or extreme harm from gambling. If you think that the evidence shows that 6 to 10 people around everyone who's experiencing harm will be negatively impacted by that, then the number of people impacted by this industry is in the many, many millions. And the types of harms that we're talking about, we touched on suicide, which is at the very, very acute end of harm. The Department of Health estimates between 117 and 496 suicides in England are related to gambling every year, which is almost 10% of all suicides at the upper range. And that will be at the very top of the kind of pyramid of harm, if you will. Below that, you'll have all sorts of mental health harms impacting people's quality of life. You'll have very deep financial harms, harms to families, children not getting school clothes, harms to relationships, family breakdown. There's a lot of crime associated with gambling caused by gambling disorder and addiction, which really drives people to go and find additional funds to gamble with very often. And some people will turn to crime for that. So there's a kind of plethora of negative impacts, which are disastrous for people. Of course, they're also bad for the economy, which is another angle that we take with the policymakers. But of course, the reason that I do this and any other reformer does it is because of the impact on the people. But if you're not concerned about the impact on the people and you think about economic growth, there's a lot of evidence that actually the gambling industry is really bad for economic growth as well, because if you remember that most of the revenue, particularly for online gambling operators, comes from people who are experiencing harm and people who can't afford those scale of losses, well, you must consider that actually a lot of that money that's spent on online gambling would be spent elsewhere on other things that would produce much more value for the economy and for the taxman than an online gambling website, which will typically be based in Malta or Gibraltar and creates very little employment and really is designed to just extract cash from human beings. So there's really strong evidence that actually if we suppress the gambling market and reduce the size of the gambling industry, that will support economic growth. We might come back to that because the politicians tend to ignore that one as well at the moment, I'm afraid. So we've got one of the most liberalized gambling markets in the world, and the regulations around gambling advertising are equally liberal. I thought I'd just talk you through kind of what regulation there is. And it's largely left in the hands of the gambling and advertising industries. So to be able to advertise gambling in Britain, you do require a gambling commission license. And within the license codes, you've got to abide by the Committee of Advertising Practice and the Broadcast Committee of Advertising Practice codes on gambling advertising. And they also suggest that you abide by the Betting and Gaming Council's industry group for responsible gambling's codes on responsible gambling advertising, which are created by the gambling industry. So all advertising in Britain is regulated, I use that term very loosely, by something called the Advertising Standards Authority, which enforces the codes as set out by the Committee of Advertising Practice, so the CAP. The ASA and the CAP are basically sister organizations. They sit in the same office. One sets the codes, the other enforces the codes. They are self-declared self-regulators, so they are funded by the advertising industry. They're not a public authority. They are not they don't have to abide by rules that would govern statutory authorities. So, for example, they are not, they won't be transparent. They don't apply the Freedom of Information Act to their activities. So you can't challenge them and ask for transparency around how they come to a decision and that sort of thing. They are very much a self-regulator. The people making the decisions on whether codes have been breached tend to be advertising executives. And if you remember what I said, that 1.5 billion pounds a year is spent on gambling advertising, you can imagine how willing the advertising executives are to upset their biggest funders. Not very willing at all. So the self-regulatory framework is very, very weak. And the Betting and Gaming Council, who run this industry group for responsible gambling, who've set up their own responsible advertising codes, if you will. I mean, I take the position that there's no such thing as a responsible gambling advert. That's an oxymoron, because you are promoting a health-harming activity. But they believe in socially responsible gambling advertising, and they set some of their own rules about when you can advertise and what you can advertise and how to avoid advertising for children, all of which really I believe is a bit of a smokescreen, because the operators are very clearly able to reach children and young people as well as adults with a bombardment of advertising, and there's absolutely nothing socially responsible about it. So it's of deep concern to people like me that the regulatory framework in this area is governed really by two groups with very deep conflicts of interest: the advertising industry and the gambling industry, who are really only interested in growing revenues rather than protecting the public. I thought I'd just give you a kind of example of the codes and point out how loosely worded they are. You're not supposed to exploit susceptibilities of children, for example. You're not supposed to link gambling to seduction or sexual success. The one that's very often challenged and very disappointed in response is to be of strong appeal to children or young persons. So the Committee of Advertising Practice says that gambling adverts can't be of strong appeal to children. They're allowed to appeal to children, but they can't be of strong appeal to children. So who judges whether an advert is of strong appeal or just of appeal? The advertising executives. And as you can imagine, most of the time when we take a complaint to them, they say, well, it's not of strong appeal to children. To give you an example of kind of the dance that they do around this, they did come up with a rule recently, a few years ago, that serving footballers can't feature in gambling adverts. Okay. So if you're currently playing football in the Premier League, you're not allowed to feature in a gambling advert. But if you've recently retired, you can, because a recently retired player won't be of strong appeal to children. What an absolute nonsense, right? This idea that from one day to the next, you've retired from football and therefore you're no longer of strong appeal to children. Or if you're a football manager, you'll see an example of an advert in a moment of Jurgen Klopp, very famous former manager of Liverpool Football Club, and the idea that young boys wouldn't be absolutely obsessed with Jurgen Klopp and that he wouldn't be of strong appeal to children, I find patently ridiculous, but the Committee of Advertising Practice do not. So you can see how the rules are very favourable to the gambling industry. Oh, there's the picture of Jurgen Klopp. So the other issue is that even when the rules are broken, very, very little is done. I'll talk you through these three images. Actually, two of them are from this week. The one on the left is Jurgen Klopp, former Liverpool manager. And this is an example of content marketing by a company called Paddy Power. So this didn't actually cost Paddy Power anything, right? So this is a post put up on X, formerly known as Twitter, featuring Jurgen Klopp, and it's a quip trying to be funny. They know that these type of humorous images with little one-line jokes alongside them are very readily shared by young people. It's an activity that young people will just share these things. You can see this one was seen over 97,000 times. Some proportion of those 97,000 views will have been by children and young people, undoubtedly. Now, so when this one was reported to the Advertising Standards Authority, we got mixed answers from the Advertising Standards Authority. The first one was, well, so we think that this one breaches two rules at least, right? An advert, a gambling advert, is supposed to be clearly identifiable as a gambling advert, and it's not supposed to be of strong appeal to children. And we thought this advert broke both those rules. But the Advertising Standards Authority said, well, actually, the fact that the Paddy Power logo in the top left corner is there, we think that probably does mean that it's identifiable as an advert. And actually, Jurgen Klopp's not a serving footballer, so we're not in breach here, right? And even if we were in breach, this advert was posted from overseas. This advert was posted from the Republic of Ireland, and therefore it falls out of our remit. So we're not going to do anything about it. That's what the ASA said. And there are other examples of adverts by Paddy Power and other companies which have been posted from overseas, but they are clearly targeted at UK consumers. So they have the pound sign in them, they have a UK website on them, but they know that there's a very easy workaround, which is simply to post an advert from overseas. And the ASA say, well, in that instance, we work with our colleagues in for this advert, we would work with our colleagues in the Republic of Ireland and get them to take action against Paddy Power. But their colleagues in the Republic of Ireland would only be able to push rules that they've got set. So there may not be the same standards, not that our standards are high. But also you can imagine how long that takes. And by that time, this advert's been shared and it's moved on. So it's almost pointless to complain about them, because by the time any action would be taken in this instance, they will have posted another 100 of these. And this one would have been long gone and seen and shared, and they would have moved on. So there really is very little recourse for concerned members of the public or people like me to try and get that type of advert taken down. It's too late. It's already been seen by kids. The industry effectively, very cleverly grooming the next generation with this type of subtle advertising, normalizing gambling and gambling operators' names and logos. The next image worthy of note is this one in the middle. Gambling ad featuring porn star Bonnie Blue prompts call for crackdown. So this is a wild story, actually. Over Christmas, colleagues of mine and I saw on X an account posting videos of this lady who's a pornographic actress enticing young men into sex, and gambling logo pasted all over the front of it. And it was clearly labeled as a gambling ad, so it didn't break that rule. So it said it was a gambling ad. And so this breaches all sorts of rules, right, that the Advertising Standards Authority is supposed to enforce. It's not decent, and advertising generally has to be decent. It clearly links sex to gambling, which is a clear breach of their codes. I think it is a very strong appeal to young men, particularly. If anyone knows teenage boys, this is going to be a strong appeal to them. So any ideas to the contrary, I think, is ridiculous. So breach all the rules you could imagine. And so I reported it to the Advertising Standards Authority, who in this case, they did say that does look like a very serious complaint. But the company who posted it, Stake, don't have a gambling license in Great Britain. And therefore, this is an illegal advert. And I said to them, well, actually, you're wrong, because they do have a gambling license in Great Britain. This company is so big in Great Britain, it sponsors Everton Football Club, it's extremely well-known brand in Britain. And they run their license through another entity. And they said, well, because the license is technically with this other entity and not with the Stake parent company who placed the ad, we can't do anything. So we're going to pass it to the Gambling Commission. So you can see there an example of how the ASA have just very quickly found a loophole to not take any action on this and to basically wash their hands of it and fling it over the fence to the Gambling Commission. So I emailed the Gambling Commission and they say, oh, thank you. Yes, well, we'll look into that, but we can't tell you if we're going to do anything or what action we would take if we did do anything. The Gambling Commission is very opaque and very slow in its investigations. And since that advert has been up, actually, Stake has posted another 7 or 8 similarly sexualized adverts, which have been viewed over 20 million times on X alone, and they're also appearing on Instagram. So many, many, many millions of views of these adverts, and nothing has been done. Nothing at all. And it goes on. And finally, this image on the right, oh, sorry, go back, about gambling ads appearing on kids' phones. So on games that are targeted at young people. So this was a story in yesterday's iNews. who investigated, following a colleague of mine's flag, that her children's phones, they were playing games on their phones, and she looked over their shoulders and she saw gambling adverts popping up, and she thought, how can this be possible? The games they're playing are rated for 4+, age 4+. How can it be possible that licensed gambling operators are actually getting to children who are 4+? And actually, some action was taken here. I think Apple realized this was potentially a very bad story, so they've taken those games off of their store, I believe. And the operators in question have, started running around saying, well, it was never our intention to reach children in this way. One might question that. But so in this instance, actually, there may well be some self-regulatory action to avoid any further statutory action being taken, because it was so heinous, and iNews managed to get 3 or 4 parliamentarians to comment on the story. So I think they realized they better do something about this one. But you can see it's really only a result of pressure from the media and from politicians rather than the regulatory regime functioning. There is no functioning regulatory regime for gambling advertising in this country, would be my conclusion. And all of this has been known for a long time. The Conservative government reviewed gambling laws for a number of years between sort of 2020 and 2023, and came up with a white paper, which Alison mentioned at the start of this talk. But in the white paper, virtually nothing was proposed on gambling advertising. The only thing that was proposed was a little bit more self-regulation, this time by the Premier League, who committed, as part of the government's reforms, to get their teams to remove gambling adverts from the front of football shirts. That doesn't mean that, so, to put that in context, I think it's something like 7% of gambling logos that are visible in Premier League matches are on the front of football shirts, and the other 93% are on the sleeves or on the side hoardings in the middle of the stadiums, running around the hoardings in the middle. So actually this would in effect do very little. And of course, they didn't say that they would take the logos off the shirts entirely, so they might just move the logo to the sleeve or the back of the shirt, and it's not going to come in to force until 2026, 27. And to give it a little extra context, Mark Palios, who's the chairman of a mid-league team, used to be the FA chair, leader of the FA rather, said this is to suggest that children who are fans of lower league teams don't need protection from gambling advertising either, because it does nothing to stop gambling logos being portrayed in the lower leagues. So really, in effect, quite a meaningless reform, but it gave the Conservative government something to put in the white paper to suggest that they'd done something on gambling advertising, when in reality they'd done virtually nothing, which was very difficult to accept for those of us who've been campaigning on this issue for many years. And Alison asked me to kind of make mention, I think somebody else on the call mentioned tobacco, so I thought I would throw this slide in, just an idea, why was there no action taken on advertising in the white paper, and why were actually many of the white paper reforms not what people in public health would expect them to be? Might it be because the industry's lobbying powers and powers of sowing doubt are very well honed and have been borrowed from the tobacco industry? And really, I think the gambling industry has taken the tobacco industry's playbook and sort of juiced it up, if you will, to the max, and have deployed it with great effect to resist reform. And I put these 3 images here about some of the tactics they use. The first, I mean, these are now out of date, but the first is this issue about MPs accepting free hospitality from the gambling industry, so they give preferential access to lobbyists from the gambling industry. In fact, this MP, Scott Benton, was caught by the Times offering preferential access to the gambling industry and breaching parliamentary rules, to the point that he had to resign. from Parliament. He had the whip removed and was effectively kicked out of Parliament. It was so embarrassing. That was an undercover sting operation by the Times, but he was by no means the only one. And there's going to be a story, I believe, in the Observer tomorrow about serving parliamentarians taking hospitality from the industry. So this is an ongoing problem. And in fact, I remember doing some work with the alcohol, junk food and tobacco reformers, and they found a certain number of a certain amount of hospitality offered by those industries to parliamentarians, and then they also discovered that the gambling industry on its own dwarfed that sum, the combined total from the junk food, alcohol, and tobacco industries. So the gambling industry really is pushing very hard on this tactic of bending MPs' ears through giving them hospitality. The middle image there is a piece of research, this one commissioned by PwC, but it's a well-worn tactic of health-harming industries to commission research that either diverts, distracts attention onto other topics, or sows doubt on the evidence base. This one was a diversionary tactic, so it's about unlicensed online gambling in the UK. So this idea, basically, it pushes this idea that if you clamp down on the regulated gambling market, you'll just push people to the black market. So don't clamp down on us. We're safer than they are. You mustn't over-regulate us, or people just go to the black market. The tobacco industry used this tactic very well. I remember it as a child when debates were going on about increasing tax on cigarettes, and the tobacco industry said, well, people will just drive to France to buy their cigarettes, and this won't work, and it's ridiculous. How dare you? You mustn't do that. You'll actually reduce tax revenue. So again, well-worn tactic of health-harming industries about alternatives that people will be pushed to. And finally, on the right of the screen, I've put up some images of kind of industry initiatives to try and promote the idea of self-regulation. So this is Safer Gambling Week, their own safer gambling messaging. That old one, when the fun stops, stop. That one's been replaced with something that says take time to think. So this idea that they push the government that, don't worry, we can protect people ourselves. You don't need to regulate us because we're caring, friendly, kind industry, and we'll help those poor few people who might be vulnerable to gambling addiction to stop before they get harmed. We can spot them. We're interested in safer gambling. Actually, the impact of all of that messaging is that it pushes responsibility away from industry products and practices onto individuals, which is very stigmatizing. Is probably at least partially responsible for the very high rates of suicidality amongst people who gamble. And again, was a tactic of the tobacco industry many years ago, and it's still a tactic of the alcohol industry too. This idea of responsible drinking, putting the onus on you to drink responsibly, whilst they advertise telling you to drink more and more and more, and how fun and sexy and safe it is. And there used to be this concept of responsible smoking. Believe it or not, I found some adverts from the 60s and 70s about responsible smoking. So again, the tobacco industry played this card very effectively for many years. So, I think clearly without the industry's lobbying, we would have much stronger regulations on gambling and much stronger regulations on gambling advertising. So it's this type of activity which we're going to have to overcome if we're going to get there. And sadly, is it still new? I guess it's still new-ish. The Labour government look like they're taking a similar line on advertising. So the Secretary of State at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is Lisa Nandy. She said in October, "We want gambling to thrive." I'm going to read this next paragraph out because it's worth a little bit of analysis as well, because it shows the kind of thinking in the narrative. She said, "We're also very aware of the problems that can be caused by problem gambling. And as the previous government did, we are determined to talk to the widest range of partners to ensure that we strike the right balance to protect people from the problems that can ensue, but also to support the growing industry." So this idea that the problems are caused by problem gambling. They're not caused by gambling, they're caused by problem gambling. So pushing away this idea that gambling is the source of the harm and that it's problem gambling caused by, if she'd gone further, she might have said problem gamblers. So it's the people, that idea, this idea of problem gamblers puts it cites the source of the problem in the individual rather than in the products and the practices. So again, you can warrant the idea of growing the industry whilst helping those people rather than having to suppress the industry to be able to protect people from harm. This idea of balance, I find in this context really insidious as well. The idea that we balance the needs of people and communities with the need to support a growing industry. This industry operates absolutely against the interests of humans. Right? Any growth of this industry is not in the interests of human beings. There is no balance to be struck, if you ask me. So I'm always very concerned when politicians start talking about balance. But really, this issue of we want gambling to thrive. So she wants to grow the industry. And that's clearly going to be a problem for us in this space. However, there is also lots of cause for optimism that we can force action. So as Alison mentioned at the start, over 50% of the public believe that all gambling advertising, promotion and sponsorship should be banned. That was a poll that was conducted for the Coalition to End Gambling Ads last year, but it's by no means the only poll. This has been a consistent finding in various polls by various different polling companies for a number of years. The public are not keen on the gambling industry. It's one of the most unpopular industries in Britain. I think advertising is particularly unpopular. It's the bit of the industry that people see the most. Those who don't gamble still see the gambling advertising and are really put off by it, are inundated by it. And parents don't want their kids to see it. They don't want to see it themselves. So it's the policy probably that the public are most concerned about, which gives us an opportunity to use it as the policy position to kind of open up a broader debate about other gambling policy changes that are required, because ending gambling advertising is certainly not the only reform to the industry that we need to see to make it a lot less dangerous. 78% of the public believe that no child should be exposed to gambling advertising. And I find that particularly helpful because really, if we're going to ensure that no child is exposed to gambling advertising, you're going to have to ban pretty much all gambling advertising, because children are online, the industry finds ways around restrictions. You're going to need to go very far in terms of ending gambling advertising to make sure that no child is ever exposed. So that level of support is really powerful. The other positive here is I've put the APPG. By that, I mean the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Gambling Reform. Used to be called the Gambling Related Harm All-Party Parliamentary Group. An All-Party Parliamentary Group is what it sounds like. It's a group of MPs and peers from all the parties. So whatever your political colours are, you're allowed to join such a group in Parliament, and they look at evidence, they work towards trying to increase pressure on the serving government to reform gambling in this case, which is very positive. It's now chaired by Sir Ian Duncan Smith, obviously former leader of the Conservative Party, but it's got very strong representation from Labour and the Lib Dems as well, and the Greens. And there's also a group called Peers for Gambling Reform, which is led by the phenomenal parliamentarian Lord Don Foster, who used to be a whip in the coalition government, used to be a Lib Dem MP, and who has been involved in gambling regulation and trying to protect people for many years, and really knows his stuff like no other. I think there are about 150 members of the Lords who are in that group, Peers for Gambling Reform, that is chaired by Don, and he tirelessly campaigns and pushes for reform, and I think gives us great cause for hope that that this will be taken up. And there are other leading figures in the Lords. The Bishop of St Albans has been an absolutely fantastic champion for this cause. And others. So we do have some really good, strong parliamentarians on side who are kind of leading the charge in this in this area. And I'm very nearly finished. I thought I'd just end on this somewhat light-hearted, if a little hopeful slide, that I've cheekily said it might just take a small reshuffle to change the dynamics, and put a picture of Thangam Debonair up there, who was the Shadow Secretary of State for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, so would have had control of this area in her brief had she not lost her seat to the Green Party. She was Bristol, I think it was Bristol Central MP for a number of years, and lost her seat to the Greens in Bristol, probably largely because of the Gaza conflict and Labour's position on Gaza. She is a Quaker, so I thought this was particularly relevant for today's meeting. We felt when she was Shadow Secretary of State that she would have made a very good minister, and there are the odd rumours now. She's just been put into the House of Lords by the Labour administration. The current gambling minister is a lady called Baroness Fiona Twycross, who's also in the Lords. So it is not inconceivable that Thangam Debonair may well be given a role in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport at some point in the future when a reshuffle happens. And I think from the reform side, we would certainly welcome that, and we shall see. So I'll stop there, Alison, if you want to stop recording, and then we can open it up for questions.